is the Buffalo Valley area, and you can see that from 1999 to 2005 we averaged 766 elk each year, and the graph depicts that. And then the 2006 to 2010 average is 354, and last year we were just under 300. So again, we've got a lot of real estate there. There's been a lot of habitat treatments there, and we'd like to see those animals start staying out, and so we're shutting hunting seasons off. We're trying to get those animals to stay out a little bit longer. In response to these changes is we start adjusting hunting season licenses or the opportunity for people to participate in a hunt. So to regulate the number of people that are out there, you either cut licenses or you shorten the season dates. And one of the things we've done in the grow line is shorten season dates. In the Moran area, we've shortened season dates, and then we started cutting licenses. And you can see that bull licenses that were issued in that area. We're down to 75 licenses this year, and next year the bull licenses will be gone. And that's basically because of the concerns we had for those migratory elk and the impacts of what we're seeing with the ability of that population to reproduce. But again, 75 is a whole different deal, and I'll try and talk a little bit more about that. But 79 is primarily northern migrants from Yellowstone, a few resident elk that are there, but we're trying to adjust our hunting season structure so that those northern migrants have more protection. Periodic basis is the reproduction during the summer. And so in 2010 we went into Yellowstone, we flew, the dots on the map are where I observed elk groups, and then I broke out with a call-out box showing what the reproduction was in those areas. In the southern end we did a ground survey, and in about 7 or 8 days we counted 600 elk in the subdivisions south of the airport. The important thing to look at here is that this area 78 had 42 calves per 100, and it also had 14 spikes. So what that tells us is during a 2-year period you get an assessment of what the reproduction was for those 2 years. When you compare that to Yellowstone, you see we have 21 calves per 100 and 7 spikes. And basically this area down here reproduced at twice the rate that the elk did in Yellowstone. And so there again, our concerns for the migratory segment becomes, can this population even sustain itself with no hunting? And so that was the reason we went with limited hunting in Area 79, shortened seasons in these two areas, and then we combined Area 74 with 81 to give those elk that migrate down more protection. And so, and on the other hand, you got these elk down here. In the summer, they're reproducing at such a high level. They had it for 2 different years, you can see with the 14 calves and 42 spikes. So we've got to be creative in terms of how we set hunting seasons to control those elk that reside in the southern end of the herd and in the park and in the subdivisions. So this is a September flight. Most of these radio collars were in the southern end of the park, and then once we got into September they started shifting into 78. And so we see this is October and then November, and you can see those animals are pretty much unavailable right now. They're in some pretty thick development, and we have some hunting in some of these larger parcels, but in effect it's not doing a whole lot for that population to control their growth. So I went back into that area. I laid another set of dots on here. So the kind of the light red dots are where I flew October 13th, and then the blue lines where I flew with the helicopter. The bottom line is I counted 550 elk in there from a fixed wing airplane, and so the population in there is doing quite well, and those animals typically move across to the refuge, and so we're having a real hard time with management of that population. Another radio collar that some of the local groups here had funded, we put on, Eric actually put it on the refuge, and that elk summered in this north end of the 78 and then south of Moose. The town of Moose is right here. And you can see how that animal moved back and forth to the refuge through Hunter Area 75. And again, our feeling is that Area 75 is integral to our management of the overall population. And again, we've got that 5,000 objective on the refuge, and that's going to be pretty unachievable if we cannot harvest and get a control on this population that come from the southern end of the herd unit. We start getting together with the refuge personnel, and we start looking at some of the key forage sites on the refuge. And the next couple of slides I have basically to show some of the production out there and some of the things that we're doing out with Eric and the refuge staff before we start feeding operators and domestic animals in the valley. And with a lot of the hobby ranches and stuff that are here, it becomes problematic to try and keep elk out of everyone's little subdivision. Those animals start getting real aggressive, and we've had horses killed because of elk. We've had horses killed because of bison, and so it's one of those things that we need to keep tabs on. Even with the snow, it's not a bad thing for the elk. They can still get through it. But what happens is when you get those animals move through the area, they pack it down. They do consume a bunch of the forage, but then pretty soon that ground starts hardening up and that snow hardens up, and it becomes pretty difficult for those animals to basically acquire the forage that they need on a daily basis. And they don't have the adequate forage available to them. That's when we start seeing them moving towards the highways. We see them trying to get into the subdivisions, and so we're a little sensitive to when they start to move closer to private lands where they're going to cause damage to private lands or commingle with cattle. I'm going to tell you right now, they're built for deep snow. They're built to move where they want to, and when they get into trouble, they get into next to somebody's house, they're calling and they're asking for relief because of the safety for their own family, and they don't want them there. And so bison are fed. They eat 3 times as much as an elk. I think you probably heard that and saw it in the paper before. But it's a huge problem to have 1,000 head of bison on the refuge because they consume as much as 3,000 elk. So the grow lot. I'll switch to here real quick and give you a little perspective on the grow lot. Same thing. We monitor weekly or bi-weekly to determine what the forage availability is and when those elk are basically at a point where they're going to leave the grow lot drain. As those animals are abandoning a lot of these ridges that are adjacent to the feed grounds. We're in the 50s and even in the 90s when I first moved here, we'd fly and we'd pick up a lot of elk on a lot of these adjacent slopes. There's been some burns on Wolf Ridge. Yep, vegetation enhancements. And this guy back there did most of them.
Okay, but that's what, I don't know what you meant.
Yeah, no, it's prescribed burns. There's some places they've done some mechanical treatments in the Buffalo Valley on that front right by Black Rock Ranger Station. They've done some timber sales to reduce fire potential next to the urban areas. And in effect, that'll actually help some of those elk too by opening that country up a little bit.
You know, if we look at the Cody study, and they had the sort of sedentary segment of the large herd up there seem to be doing okay reproduction-wise. And do you think there's, and then the migratory segment that's moving a long ways to around summer to winter range is not doing so well? You've kind of got the same thing going on here, or am I wrong? And have you talked to McWhorter about any relationship?
Yeah, I have, but you know, I think that it's a little bit different here because these animals are 90% of the, or 80% of the population is being fed a pretty high nutritious diet. And so, granted, the summer forage that they're seeing and the potential for reduction in pregnancy, some of that may be going on, but I don't think it's quite the same. I think we're probably just a little bit different situation with feed grounds. The study that was done in Yellowstone showed, and Bruce Smith's study showed that the first 6 weeks of life is when those calves are most vulnerable to predation. So after their 6 weeks, there seems to be a period of time when they're not as vulnerable to bear predation. So their survival kind of goes up a little bit for a while until they get to the winter period. And then post-season numbers are February.
If you could explain a little more, I'm real curious about the long-term shifts in population, about how many elk used to come from Yellowstone.
Yeah,
what do you think the driving forces are behind that?
If you look at that map behind 50s, they annihilated some of those migrations off the eastern end of Togety. So from Togety Lodge, in that general vicinity, they lost a lot of those migration behaviors. And since the late 80s and 90s, the 90s when I showed up here, a lot of our effort was to reestablish those northern migrant movements. Since I've been here, we haven't killed a cow elk in that area north of Togety Highway and Black Rock Ranger Station to affect any kind of change. I mean, it didn't, even though we weren't harvesting cows, the recruitment levels in those populations that were having calves wasn't high enough to sustain some of those elk. And so, and granted, our hunting season's running in the Buffalo Valley with 1,800 tags. We started dropping back, but maybe it wasn't quick enough. And so we're doing what we can now to give them the maximum amount of protection, but I think a combination of factors with our harvesting, the predation levels from bears and wolves, and Montana, or Yellowstone did a pretty comprehensive study of calf survival, And I think it's pretty similar to what we're seeing in that southern herd. Last year we had our first elk killed in the subdivision south of Wilson, and it was killed in broad daylight. People were walking their dogs. Bear got a spike elk to take off, and they took it down right in front of a bunch of people. We pulled in with a bear trap, and the bear happened to just come right down and jump in the trap because of the stinky bait, and we hauled it out of there. But that's going to be more commonplace. Last year too, we had wolves. This is the first time we documented wolves killing elk in the subdivisions behind the airport. So I think that's just going to be continual.
Hunting zones to come south, and yet you're all about reducing, the scale of the population in the south. Why are you affording more protection? Why aren't you? Because
historically the bulk of the elk came from Yellowstone, and now the bulk of the elk are coming from Spring Gulch, and so those northern elk don't have enough calves in the population to replace the deaths of the adults naturally. So what's going to happen up there is that age structure of that elk population is getting older and older and older, but there's no younger animals to come in to replace the older ones. And so over harvest, or we have a bunch of people take cows out of that population, we could end up causing that segment to crash.
Well, and what I'm remarking on is, why the nuanced approach to shortening hunting? And so why are you hunting north if you want the spread? As a hunting and fishing agency, our goal is to maintain opportunity for all publics, whether it's consumptive and non-consumptive. And in that Yellowstone segment, taking the handful of bulls that we do right now, because we know the bull harvest is not, our feeling is that the ratio of bulls is not to the point where you can't support some hunting. And then if you look at the Cody area, for example, they felt that their bull ratios could not sustain that, and so instead of completely closing the season, they went to, say they had, each year they'd have 200 bulls killed that migrate out of Yellowstone on their side. They went to, instead of having anyone that wanted to buy a license could, they went to a limited number of people. And I don't know what that number is now, but it's pretty low. And we could go that way and become more constrictive, but with the numbers of animals that are still there and the numbers of bulls, we feel that we can sustain that level of harvest. And then conserving wildlife. Is there any circumstance where you would close off, say, 50 square miles and say just drive a little further to do your hunting? For the benefit of spreading the wildlife and spreading the wildlife population? Sure.
In the turn of the century, they had the Teton Game Preserve, which had a huge area that was closed. But when populations got to the point where they felt there was damage on those summer ranges, they opened them back up. And again, as a management agency that promotes hunting and fishing, we're not willing to give up something that can still sustain opportunity for hunting, if we can afford them protection. The moose, on the other hand, we did do that. This was the first time in 99 years that the Teton Wilderness was closed to hunting. So as long as the population base that originates there can sustain some level of opportunity for people to participate in hunts, we're going to see that people can still do that.
Yeah, but effectively, we're just to create, a place for wildlife to spread more, in more attractive ways for you. You're not using. In other words, you're trying to tackle the density of the southern population with 10, 12 nuanced strategies, but the idea of making it easier for wildlife to stay, further north is not one of the tools you would use.
But it is, in a sense, it is, because the hunting pressure is south of those elk, and as they come south, we've seen it on the south end of the refuge. When those elk hit hunting pressure, they do bounce back.
So you're still applying hunting pressure of short season.
Oh, you've got feeding pressure on
the hunting pressure up north runs from September through November 6th, and the average movement date out of Yellowstone to the refuge is around that first week of November, and that's why we adopted that November 6th date. So in effect, we've taken out a huge ability for people to participate in those hunts already.